Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One Take in that it's, in one take and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, and I think we're on paper 4 of the 5-part series on the psychology of air quality, I want to talk about trust. Specifically, do you trust the people telling you that the air is bad? And more importantly, does that trust or lack of it actually change what you do about it? I've been reading a really interesting paper published in the International Journal of Urban Sciences, and it's titled Communicating Particulate Matter Risk, the Effects of Empoweredness and Trust in Government Information and Protective Behaviour, and this was based out of Seoul. Now, before you switch off thinking, Simon, I don't live in Seoul, bear with me, because the challenges they are facing there, dense urban populations, high levels of particulate matter or PM, and a public that is increasingly anxious about health are universal. Seoul is just a really good laboratory for this because the concern about PM there is actually higher than the concern about climate change. So here's the setup. We know air pollution is a killer. It causes an estimated 7 million premature deaths a year globally. The government knows this too, so they push out information. They give us air quality indexes, apps, text alerts, and behaviour recommendations like wear a mask or don't exercise outdoors in certain conditions. But here's the problem, and I'm sure you've seen this in your own work and life. Not everyone listens. Even when the information is right there in front of them, people don't always take protective action. Why is that? This paper tries to answer that question by looking at something called the Extended Parallel Process Model, or EPPM. Now, I won't bore you with that too much, but traditionally, EPPM says that for people to act, they need two things. First, they need to feel the threat. Is this dangerous? And am I susceptible? And second, they need to feel efficacy. Do I have the ability to fix this? And will the solutions actually work? I'm sure you're picking up plenty of mirrors from the previous papers we were talking about here. But the authors of this paper argue that this isn't enough. They think that the traditional model misses the mark because it ignores the wider context of how we feel about our own power and, crucially, how we feel about the source of the information. So they expanded the model. They introduced a concept called empoweredness. This isn't just about, can I put a mask on? It goes deeper. It includes things like hope. Do I visualize a future with clean air? It includes values. Do I think it's meaningful and worthwhile to try to reduce pollution? And it includes collective response efficacy. Can we as a society fix this if we work together? And then they added the secret sauce, trust in government information. Yeah, I know. Do citizens actually believe the data and the advice they are getting from the authorities? They surveyed 513 citizens in Seoul to test this new model. And the results are honestly really fascinating for anyone trying to communicate about air quality. First off, the basics held true. If people perceived the risk as severe, they were more likely to take protective action. That's almost an exact correlation to the paper we talked about last week. No surprise there. Fear, or at least a healthy respect for the danger, does motivate people. Also, demographic-wise, they found that women and older people were more likely to engage in protective behaviours. Again, that tracks with what we often see in health research. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they looked at empoweredness, they found that self-efficacy, believing that you can handle the situation, was a strong predictor of action. But so was values. This is a key insight. People were more likely to take action if they felt that reducing PM was a worthwhile or meaningful thing to do. It wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about the intrinsic value of contributing to a solution. The researchers suggest This is linked to environmental stewardship. So if you're designing a campaign appealing to people's sense of value and meaning is actually pretty effective. However, and this is a big but in the paper, several of the other factors, specifically individual response efficacy, collective response efficacy, and hope, didn't seem to work on their own. Just telling people wearing a mask works, that's individual response efficacy, or we can fix this together, collective efficacy, didn't necessarily lead to action across the board. Why? Because of trust. The study found that trust in government information acts as a moderator or a boundary condition. Let me explain what that means, because it's probably the most important takeaway from this document. For people who had low trust in the government's information, it didn't matter how much hope they had or how much they believed their mask could work in theory. If they didn't trust the source, those feelings didn't translate into action. But for people who did trust the government's information, those variables suddenly turned on. If you trust the source, then your belief that a solution works does lead to doing it. If you trust the source, your hope for a clean air future does motivate you to act. Think about the implications of that. We spend so much time in this industry arguing about the technical accuracy of sensors or filtration efficiency for an air purifier. We focus on response efficacy, proving that the solution works. But this paper suggests that if the person receiving that message doesn't trust the messenger, whether that's a government, a landlord, or an air quality professional, all that technical proof is effectively useless. Trust unlocks the potential of the other motivations. It allows an individual's sense of empowerment to actually be fully extended into behavioural change. The authors specifically mentioned that hope, visualising a future without PM concerns, only predicted behaviour for those with high trust. Without trust, hope might just be wishful thinking, or the paper cites from the other research, a form of denial. But with trust, hope becomes a driver for action. They also looked at collective efficacy. We often hear that we need to act together to solve air pollution, but the study showed that believing society can handle the risk only led to personal action, again, if the person trusted the government information. It seems people need to feel that the conductor of the orchestra, the government, is competent and honest before they are willing to play their part in collective effort. So what does that mean for us? What's the practical application? The authors argue that policymakers need to prioritise building trust as much as they prioritise monitoring air pollution. You can't just put up a digital billboard showing PM 2.5 levels like the ones they have in Seoul subways and expect behaviour to change if the people looking at it are cynical about the data. They suggest innovative approaches to build this trust. One idea they mention is citizen science or citizen sensing. This is something we've talked about on the podcast before. By involving the public in the data collection process, giving them the sensors, letting them see the data for themselves, you increase transparency. When people participate in the science, they trust the data. And when they trust the data, the paper shows that they are much more likely to listen when you tell them how to protect themselves. It turns the public from a passive recipients of alerts into active participants in risk management. The paper does have some limitations, of course. It was an online survey, so it represents people who are comfortable with the internet. It relies on self-reported behaviour, not observed behaviour. And it's a snapshot in time again, not a longitudinal study. So we have to be careful about assuming cause and effect. But the core message, I think, is incredibly powerful. If we want to protect public health, we can't just be engineers and scientists. We have to be communicators and trust builders. The paper concludes that trust in government information serves as a boundary condition. If you don't meet that boundary, if you don't cross that threshold of trust, your advice falls on deaf ears. It suggests that values, the perceived meaningfulness of taking action, is a button we should be pressing more often. Don't just tell people it's safe. Tell them it's worthwhile. Tell them this matters. And finally, it reminds us that empowerment isn't just an individual thing. It's about the relationship between the citizen and the system. If that relationship is broken, the air quality monitors are just expensive ornaments. It's a really thought-provoking piece, this, and I'll pop it in the show notes as usual. And it makes you think about how we frame our own advice, doesn't it? That's it for this week's One Take. As usual, thanks a million to our sponsors, Safe Traces and Imbia. Without them, these podcasts would simply not be possible. See you again next time.